As somebody who does this and has a massive audience, and it's clear that you deeply respect the audience, there's a trust relationship. It's a great show. And do you find when you look at the comments and the emails coming in, does it worry you? It certainly does when I see some of mine sometimes.
It
The
does.
incapacity of people to hold competing, contradictory, or nuanced thoughts, and the emotiveness of a reaction to an opposing point of view or thought. Does that it's something I find very, very concerning, and is something that has changed incredibly over the arc of my adult life.
Yeah, I'm very troubled by it. And, I showed my audience some of the messages I got over the last week from people saying, I'm canceling my paid subscription because you're just so biased on this issue of Hamas. And the idea of bias really means I have an opinion you don't like. We all have biases. These are opinion shows. By definition, it's all bias. None of us are claiming to be doing reporting here. And it's not unique, right? I mean, I know that my audience and I sometimes disagree about, for example, GMO foods. I've seen no good evidence that GMO foods are unhealthy for humans to consume. Yes, if they're GMO in order to cover them in pesticides, the pesticides can be bad. But I just don't see any evidence that GMO is unhealthy. Some people in my audience disagree. They say it's bad for you. On nuclear, many in my audience are reflexively against nuclear power, like as a bridge to renewables, because they think of the safety record of the 70s. And I know a little bit about how new nuclear would be built, and I don't think there's a safety issue. And I'd be open to doing that as a bridge to renewables. Many in my audience disagree, but those disagreements don't have the texture of I'm canceling my membership right now, that me just saying, hey, like, yes, when any civilian dies, it's a tragedy. When any child dies, it's a tragedy. But imagine if Israeli military was willing to use human shields in the way that Hamas does. What do you think would the death toll would be in these situations? Because there's not a moral equivalence in some. Canceled. I'm not even allowed to open that door. And so it's very troubling. And at the end of the day, I'm comfortable just disagreeing with people, being in the room with people I disagree with and think, hey, here's 9 things we agree with and one we disagree with. It seems that comfort is gone.
Without having the impulse to kill them, I imagine, right?
Yes,
Like
right.
destroy their lives and all of these things. I've always had friends, that just have ranged the political spectrum. I mean, from in my view, way out there, far left, right? A couple, that always been way out there on the right, and never been an issue. It's, to me, the line cross is when you deny the result of an election. The entire society foundationally is built around we apportion power through election. So I don't know how the society continues when all of a sudden you have the political leadership of one of the country's 2 parties decide we're going to opt out of the foundational element of the society.
The other things I think have been over the line would be if somebody is just straight up like a KKK anti-Semite, obviously I'm not going to have them in my social circle. Yeah, but I think these
Right,
are
of
sort of like
course.
reasonable limits.
Yeah, I mean, I have a friend group that, like, you look at any given problem, right? And you would have one guy who said, you need to spend $1 billion to send that problem. And then you got someone on the right be like, no, I think at $50, right? And I what? Like, maybe you meet in the middle somewhere. But when you look at the reaction on just on the campuses, the civilian casualties that will occur in Gaza, the loss of life is no less important than the loss of an Israeli life, the loss of a Palestinian, child is no greater an offense, in my view, in the eyes of God than the loss of an Israeli child. The difference, indisputably, is that the Israeli children killed on October 7th were murdered. And the Palestinian children who will suffer and die will die in a war that came as a result of an act of terror and murder that was state-sponsored by the Iranian regime. Full stop. And then there's an additional context. This was a pogrom. What is a pogrom? Why are pogroms important? And I suspect that those Harvard students in the most privileged cocoon that you can imagine in the country don't know, haven't been taught. They don't know a lot about the Holocaust. They don't understand what it means for Jews to hide, defenseless, waiting to be killed in that manner. And the repetition of that through history, and then the mass cheering globally for a savagery that was written about in the Jerusalem Post in terms of what are you looking at here? Right? If you've been in a war zone, you've seen death in a war zone, it's a horrible thing. But what was this? And this, according to some of the eyewitnesses, was probably comparable to what happened in Rwanda, was the level of butchery and the level of savagery. Progressivism, historically, in this country, which misunderstood has not been a Democratic Party vessel, been both parties, Teddy Roosevelt, one of the great progressives, but progressivism was steeped in a morality, an optimism, a belief of inclusion. Do you view this as an infection, a cancer? Because when you have people cheering for the savage butchering of babies before there's any type of reprisals, their first instinct, what is that? And what it is to me is anti-Semitism, obviously. And I really mean this, right? And I was, the one thing I would say Trump did good, right? I always have this question. I've never said this out loud, right? Give me one thing Trump did a good job at. And there is one thing. I think Trump did a good job with the space program. And I'm a space program guy, right? But, you know, I've kind of changed my tune over the last couple of weeks. Because we go to Mars, we're going on an Elon Musk rocket, which means probably our first export off the Earth is going to be anti-Semitism, which we should probably just keep here, right? Since it's right, like kind of the first, like sign of the first hatred, and we're not ready to get it. And I just like want to ask you, you know, I've been very outspoken, you know, as a Republican, former Republican on the right about all of this. You know, how do you think about, which I think needs to be confronted, is the baseline of immorality that there's some group dynamic, some thread across these universities that are very specific in character, where there's some sort of significant explosion of dogma grounded in anti-Semitism after unfathomable violence, they're out cheering it. I mean, can you imagine if there was a pro-ISIS rally like 5 years ago? And I just, help me figure out what that is. And as a progressive,
Yeah.
what are you going to do about it?
What we're going to do about it, I don't know. But the degree to which, I mean, listen, whenever this comes up, I'm careful to point out that I really do believe that we're talking about an extremely loud, overrepresented group of the left. The reason I'm confident in saying that is when I brought this issue to my audience, you might wrongly think, looking at the comments on my videos, etc., that the group you're describing is a huge portion of my audience. Once I told my audience about this and really started hearing from the people who they just live their lives, they go to work, they raise their kids, they listen to my show, and they don't feel the need to write me all the time. I heard from a deluge of people who said, hey, you know what? The stuff you're saying isn't even controversial to me. I'm a progressive. Obviously, you're saying things that make perfect sense. You're hearing disproportionately from a very loud group. I think that to a degree is true about the college campuses. And also there are some real problems to be dealt with. You know, my younger half sister is in college now, and I'm not going to say where she goes to school, but where she goes to school, there is a mandatory fee for an on-campus Arab American Muslim group that immediately demonstrated in favor not of the killing of children, but immediately felt that after this terrorist attack by Hamas was the time to come out and say, we're decolonializing, we're moving closer. And the on-campus Jewish group, the Hillel group, doesn't get any funding from everybody. It's, listen, if you want to donate to Hillel, you can, and you can take a guess, you know, which group is getting the appropriate amount of funding despite the controversial actions that they're taking on campus. That sort of stuff is like a structural problem in my mind. And what I think it comes down to a great degree is that Jews in the US, you have to fight to explain to people that it's a historically marginalized minority group because of many of the tropes about conspiracies to control banking in Hollywood and the sort of stuff that's become part of the narrative. And you're kind of pushing a boulder up a hill. You're swimming against the current. We saw this with the Women's March, where there was a resistance to having Jewish women on the board because they weren't marginalized enough. They were privileged in modern America, 2020, 2017, or whatever year it was. So I think it's a combination of lack of information, lack of historical knowledge, as you point out, and some successful movements that have worked along these lines to convince people.